All right, my friends, we're back again for Chapter 9, Transformation of American Society. The delay for Chapter 8 was mostly given in class during the time when I was going over the court cases and what was happening with those. Chapter 9 is a good chapter. I like it a lot. The thing about Chapter 9 that I think is interesting or unique in the way it's done is it's talking about how America's changing, of course, but I think there's two main ways it's changing in terms of how it's going through the process of the change. The first concept, let's see, where's my pen? Is it working? Oh, I gotta turn it on, hang on. My bad, my cough. One of the ways it's changing is it's changing its location. Our location is, of course, shifting across from east to west. That's kind of the nice thing to remember. The second way it's changing is we're changing our identity, and that's coming from a few factors, but most importantly, it's coming from the blending of these new people that is moving into the frontier. And that's, I think, a difference that we start seeing here. So let's go Chapter 9. Chapter 9. Okay. So one of the key things is this concept of frontier. The frontier is, I think, a huge psychological advantage to being an American. I don't know any other place, advantage, not adventure, advantage. I don't know of any other place where the frontier has been so strongly associated with life and the prospects of future. I think the fact is that because we have this concept that we can open up something that is new, something that has not been touched before, I think we have the mindset that even though we don't usually do it, we have the possibility of advancement. We have the possibility of moving into a new position of income or position in power. And I think this advancement concept is something that's truly uniquely American. I think it's something that you don't see very often, especially because that's the way it kind of sets itself up. One second. Okay, friends, so here's a key statistic for you in terms of thinking about this. By about 1835, 1840, you're looking at 1/3 of the population of the United States now west of the Appalachian Mountains. This is going to be a huge change in our perception of who we are, but also what we can do. It's in many ways a safety valve for us because we don't have a lot of class issues in terms of competition between the classes, because we're pretty much offering free land to a lot of the folks who could just get to it. And that alone is worth its weight in gold in terms of keeping people stable in terms of a society. But it also gives them the mindset that, hey, I can move up. And I don't know if that's possible. Like I say, it's probably harder to move up than it is to move down. But in a lot of the cases, it's just not that easy to kind of document. So the person who kind of sees this and is making his commentary, de Tocqueville, am I spelling it right? No, I did it wrong. Let's erase that. Where's the eraser? All right, sweet. So de Tocqueville. Come on, don't do that. De Tocqueville. And I apologize for my penmanship. De Tocqueville, the French guy, he's commenting on a couple of things. He looks at us, interestingly enough, as half wild, half civilized. That's his commentary. And the reason, of course, is he sees us in our rugged lifestyles, but he also sees us moving up in terms of power and also in terms of politics and economics. I think the key thing he sees is that we have this perception, and it's not reality, because it's not reality. We have this perception of equality because we're not equal. The elites, of course, have a tremendous advantage over everybody else. But we have a perception of equality where we think we can move, we think we can compete. And one of the, I don't know if it's one of the, but we see this identity of being self-made, that you can hack yourself out of the wilderness and you can make yourself more profitable. We also see this interesting concept of education, going back to the concepts of the Enlightenment and the thinking that even though we're not born equal, we have the concepts of equality kind of built into us via natural rights. those two alone are going to do wonders to create a new identity for the United States. And the United States, of course, is developing this as we go into these years of westward expansion. And it is about going into the West. I mean, the key part about this thought process is that the West is the place where you can make your dreams come true. Although most of the West is a desert, most of the West is not really accessible to most productivity at this point. It hasn't been tapped with transportation. It hasn't been tapped with civilization. That's kind of what's happening in that kind of concept. So this self-made concept is best exemplified, like I said, by these individuals who are going to go off and hack themselves out of the wilderness. And we describe them as mountain men. There was also women involved in the journeys as well. But these were the early trailblazers, I suppose, is the best way to describe it, which is what they called them, the trailblazers, the ones who went first. And these mountain men, Jim Bridger, Zebulon Pike, they went across these barriers, these huge barriers, Great Plains, Rocky Mountains, Sierra Nevadas. And what they were looking for, of course, was a way to get themselves wealthy. A lot of it was based on the fur trade of the time period. But they were also making connections with natives. They were also making connections with the education of, like, where do you go from here to there? How does that work? And now, once we have this westward settlement, now we have this idea that we have to civilize it. And by civilizing it, we're going to try to create systems that are going to hopefully, manipulate it. So the Land Ordinance of 1785 is going to come up with the idea of how to divide it up into grids, and the grids are going to allow it to give it a shape. And a lot of the western states in the middle of the country have the same shape or the similar shape in terms of size, and that's kind of the gift of that. The Northwest Ordinance, which, of course, these two come in the Articles of Confederation time, and that's 1787. Northwest Ordinance is pretty significant in that it's creating a process, the process to move from a territory into a state where you can have taxes, you can have organizational systems, you can have everything else put into play. These two are thrown into hyper overdrive by the development, or the best word is not development, but the acquisition of the Louisiana Purchase. Louisiana Purchase is going to create this huge drive west, and it's going to create this never-ending mindset that we can keep developing out there as long as we have the open land to get a hold of. And the Louisiana Purchase is part of that idea, how that works and how that shapes itself up and how that goes around in terms of what it does. All right. So if you're a settler, this is a good thing. However, if you're a native, this is awful. You are continually being pushed from east to west. Most of the natives in this time period are going to be, actually it should look like this, east to west. You got it. Most of the natives by this time period have been decimated by disease and warfare. Most of the native cultures have been put on the edge of survival and wiped out. One group in particular, the five civilized tribes. The five civilized tribes attempted to create the mentality of, if you can't beat them, join them. And they began to assimilate pretty easily. They started to intermarry. We had intermarriage with a lot of the white European culture of the time period. They started to adopt the culture. They started to adopt the language. And as a result of that, a lot of the five civilized tribes, by the time of, the mid-1820s, they found themselves in a position where they were trying to fit in more than fit out, if that makes sense. Around this time period, in the next chapter, you're going to heavily hear a lot about Andy Jackson. And Andrew Jackson is an interesting figure. The key thing about Andrew Jackson is that he is going to increase the president's power. No president since Washington is going to have a definition of power or an expansion of it like Andrew Jackson. The thing about Andrew Jackson that's kind of like, I don't know if it's missed, but here's the key thing. He really benefits from a widening of the popular vote, because during his presidency, we're going to move from that rule of white men with property to what's called universal manhood suffrage. Now, not all men could vote. Of course, they would divide by color. But the idea about universal manhood suffrage was that now we have a pool of individuals that are going to represent all the classes. So, as you know, probably in logical terms, there is a lot more of the poor and the middle class than there are of the wealthy. And this is going to change the dynamic of not only politics, but also how we play the game of politics. And Andrew Jackson is going to ride into a wave of popular support based on the concept that the poor middle class of the western states are going to give him the victory over the elites of the East, the landowners of the East that have been dominating all the way through, since the beginning. Now, for instance, John Quincy Adams is the son of John Adams, which is kind of wild in the sense that, you have this transition of power between father and son. But more importantly, he was an elite, he was an aristocrat from the Revolutionary period, and Jackson represents the first breakout of the middle class, or what we call the common man. Okay, that's the first thing. The second thing is that if you really think about it, politics is really about satisfying the voter. And if you can't satisfy the voters in a majority, you're not going to find yourself winning. And what Jackson realized was that his majority was of the lower middle class of the West and the South. And what does the man of the West and the South want? What does the voter of the West and the South want? He wants more land. In fact, he would love free land. And what's the key cash crop that's making this, prolifically profitable? It's cotton. So in Congress and in the presidency, there was a push to open up the land. So this puts the 5 civilized tribes in the crossfires. The key tribe, the most civilized of them all, I suppose, in terms of their size and their power, was the Cherokee Nation. And the Cherokee Nation sat in what is today commonly Georgia, South Carolina, Alabama, and I think if we go up to Tennessee, it might have reached as far as that. They were kind of a tribe that sat in most of what is today not the lowland South, but it would be called the Pine Barren South, and they were clearing the pine barrens and opening up cotton plantations, and it was highly desirable that they have that land opened up. Well, Congress, without President Jackson's veto, Congress passed something called the Indian Removal Act. Where am I at? Here we go. Removal Act. And interestingly enough, the question is a native a citizen? Are they a citizen? If they are not a citizen, do they enjoy the same protections under the law as a person who, claims citizenship underneath, I guess the best way to put it is the Constitution, but there is no citizenship clause in the Constitution yet. So the question is, of course, what makes a citizen? So as they're looking for a solution to this, Andrew Jackson capitalizes on this. He uses it as a political weapon. The idea is that during his first term in office, there will be several court cases that will challenge this. The court cases are notable for the fact that they're Federalist courts still, and the Federalist Court usually rules on behalf of the Federalist government. But here's what's interesting. In Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, and that's not California, that's Georgia, and in Worcester versus Georgia. Worcester versus Georgia. Once again, I made California there. Weird. Both court cases are being run by Marshall. You would think that he would side in behalf of the federal government. But what's ironic is that he picks the side of the Cherokees in most of the court cases. He looks at them as a domestic dependent nation, a kind of a protectorate of the United States, and it backs up their claim that the lands that they have are theirs, and it protects them from a federal attack or federal invasion. And John Marshall is going to take the side of the natives. He's going to say these natives deserve constitutional protection, and they should be protected. Now, the problem, of course, is that there is a few issues that develop because of that. Sorry for the interruption. So one of the things that comes out of this is Jackson stubbornly refuses to follow the order. I think there's a quote. I can't be sure if it's an actual quote or if it's something that's a summary of something else that somebody said. But I think Jackson states that Marshall made his decision. Let's see him enforce it. Meaning, whose job is it to enforce the law? The problem is that it's the executive branch's job, the president's job, to enforce the law. And if the executive doesn't do anything, it doesn't matter what the Supreme Court says, nothing will get done. So if you ignore the ruling, the question is, who's going to be picking up the power? Now, Congress is not against the president because the Congress and the president belong to the same political mindset, same political party. So they don't care. So now what happens is that the president is going to use his power to enforce this ruling, but he's not going to enforce it in behalf of the Supreme Court. He's going to enforce it on behalf of what Congress wants. And what's going to result, of course, is something they call the Trail of Tears. And it's another one-third, fact again. One-third of all of these folks on this journey are going to die. And they're going to be traveling between the east coast of the United States, and they're going to end up in a territory that later on will be claimed again by white settlers. And that, of course, will be Oklahoma, which was the original territorial zone for natives. Oklahoma, not Oklahoma. All right, perfect. And sadly but surely, they are going to disappear into history, and that's going to be one of the last large groups that is able to either resist or even fit in to European culture. A few things are going to start to develop agriculture here. I mean, think of it this way. You can grow your crops, but can you move them? That's one of the major problems of the Great Plains and the eastern Mississippi River valleys. The agricultural zones of the country are going to benefit, of course, from canals. Now, canals are mule-driven, horse-driven waterways, and they're going to be able to move, of course, goods between bodies of water. So if you have a lake on one side and a river on the other, between the water supplies, you're going to be able to move your goods, which I think is a nice thing to have. I can't believe I wrote it like that, sorry. The second thing is that we have new technologies. The steam engine is a crucial development here. Now, we're not the ones that invent the railroad. We're not the ones that are going to devise what rails are. But the railroad is one of the new devisements of creating a waterway on land. And that's something you start to see. And of course, they mentioned Fulton's steamboat. Fulton's steamboat is going to transform the interior of the country because now you can move stuff both up and down the Mississippi River's tributaries, and that's going to be a tremendous boost. And what you have is you have a system of trade that's going to be able to move goods long distances into markets where they never could get before. They would never be able to get them there. I mean, for instance, if you don't have a steamboat, all you can do is go down the Mississippi. So what do? You build a barge, you sail it down the Mississippi, you leave it in New Orleans. I think New Orleans was overflowing with barges. They couldn't get them back up the river. So then you hook up a paddle wheel to it that's steam-powered, and you're good to go. So as all of this is happening, we're starting to see this develop. And on the side note, we also have some machines that are helping out. The Reaper of McCormick's Reaper is going to it's going to develop a new, faster way of agricultural production. And we're going to start to see machines take over the agricultural zones of the Midwest coming in the next century. As soon as we start getting, of course, internal combustion engines running on gas, but that's something else coming down the way. So there's two forms of agriculture. There's commercial, and your job in commercial ag is, of course, to sell your crop and make a profit. Wheat is a great commercial crop, because you can't eat all of it, let's put it that way. You couldn't make enough wheat to make enough bread to kind of survive on, because there's just a surplus of that. So wheat's a great one. Another great one that's talked about a lot is, of course, cotton. Cotton is one of those that kind of gets us, thinking about the South a little bit and how that works. Excuse me. But that's commercial ag. Then there's subsistence ag. Subsistence means you're self-providing. And you're self-providing because, let's put it this way, there's nowhere to get your stuff from. There's no stores. There's no neighbors. There's just you on your own. And self-providing agriculture is probably how most people in the United States, most of them were surviving with pretty much until after the Civil War, until we had markets that could be moved by rail and connect the country together. But those two things are huge, and that's going to be a big changing the way we see everything and everybody else. With this new development of business, agricultural business, there's this huge drive to speculate on land. And land speculation is going to be one of the more dangerous pastimes for the economy. And what it's going to create, of course, is going to create the Panic of 1819. It's going to create other problems between states and between trade markets. But here's the key concept. They're guessing, they're banking that they can get out there and make more money if they can open up more land. One of the consequences of that is that the more you have of something, the price starts dropping. So if you guess wrong and everybody starts growing wheat at the same time, well, the problem is that the price of wheat comes down, you don't make as much money. So it's kind of a gamble, and that's why it's a dangerous system for people to kind of involve themselves with. But this transportation revolution we're talking about is another place where people are speculating. And the transportation revolution has a unique idea where you take public funds, and what you see is the public is going to pay for it with taxes, but the benefit is going to hopefully come back to the consumer because all of the costs of moving things are going to start dropping. It's kind of what they think of when they think of like, well, if we gave everybody free internet, what would that do? Well, that would increase people's productivity. If we gave everybody a public transportation system that was cheaper than cars, what would that do? Well, it would save us the income on cars, so we wouldn't be spending it there, we'd spend it somewhere else. So it's trying to stimulate the economy a little bit. And the revolution, of course, the investments are pretty interesting. The Erie Canal is the first major investment, and it pays itself off, I think, within 2 years, if I'm not mistaken. The investors get back like 800% in 2 years, which is just crazy numbers. But then again, think about it. That's the only way you can move goods cheap enough by transportation to make it worth it. Another one that's unique and powerful about that is the National Road. The National Road is the same idea. If we all have a good road, and we all can get there from point A to point B faster, remember, time equals money. If you can do it fast, you save money. And that's, I think, a big development to think about when you have that. And then the last one, the most expensive of them all, was creating something out of nothing, which is the railroad. And that is a very huge investment that many people in this time in history just don't have the access to the funds for it. So you don't see a lot about that. One of the key stimuluses for this is going to be the Embargo Act. So the Embargo Act is bad for us, but you might say it's the best thing that ever happened to us. Because without these things, none of these things are going to be, invested in and taken off. And that's kind of why it's not there, and that's not why it's not developing it. The Embargo Act is also going to pressure our new industry, and our new industry is starting in the north, and it's textile driven because textiles, let's face it, everybody needs them, everybody needs to wear them. But the key thing is that we make all the raw materials right here. And if the raw materials are here, think about the cost. If you can keep it here in terms of production, it's going to drop down. So we start to cut into England's manufacturing market, and I think we mentioned the Lowell and Waltham mills. Lowell and Waltham. That investment team put together the first true mill in the country. It was water powered, but remember, he was an industrial spy who stole the idea piece by piece in his brain and brought it over to the United States and basically transported the English system over here, which I think is totally unique. A lot of folks at this time are still what you would call artisans. They're making everything by hand, and of course that increases the cost. The first unions, believe it or not, are designed to protect artisans from factories. Because, let's face it, if your factory can pump out 20 shoes and I can only make a pair a day, I'm going to lose my job. So artisans started to kind of bind themselves together to fix prices. At the beginning, it was fixing prices so we could have the same profit from shoemaker to shoemaker. And later on, these unions are going to transform themselves into the hands of the workers. And remember, the first strike in the United States is the Lowell strike. And the Lowell strike is going to come when most of the young women and also some of the employees who are men are going to step up, and they're going to demand better wages and better conditions. Because let's face it, the owner's incentive is to keep everything cost low. If I have to clean up, if I have to make it safe, it costs me money. So the workers and the owners have to do this delicate balance of I need to produce, but I also need to develop an idea about that. In 1835 also, there was a coal miner strike, and the coal miners, I mean, it's hard being a coal miner, let's put it that way. I think we're lucky that we're not living in a coal miner zone of the country. But coal miners is just a hard way of living, and they would often overwork them. So they demanded a 10-hour workday, which was an improvement over their 12 to 14-hour workday. And those are the changes that are being demanded by the workers, because guess what? Here's the formula. Workers are the majority of your voters. Voters influence the selection of your politicians. Politicians will not survive unless they create policy that makes the voters happy. If they can't do that, they lose their job. So the workers begin to organize in different ways politically, and most importantly, they're starting to do that in the job itself. There is an inequality. I mean, there always has been an inequality between wealthy and poor. But here's the thing that I think is different between us and everybody else, is that we have a perception that we can be socially mobile, which, to put it simply, we believe we can move up. Now, it might not happen. It might be very hard. But you see stories all the time of people that have nothing and move up. You see this development happening in our culture today, and this is where it's coming from in this time period. And this is also a reason why we become an immigration destination. I mean, the Irish, when they immigrated, they had a lot of choices, I suppose. But there's only one choice to kind of like make it where you can actually get ahead at the start when you're poor and you're coming and you're dying from starvation. But there's also this concept of if you can get there, you can move yourself out of that place and into a better place. And maybe it won't happen for you, but it'll happen for your kids. The inequality is also racial. We have a tremendous amount of discrimination, even in the North, where you're going to have freed black slaves. Of course, this is going to be the concept of, what happens when a person leaves the southern plantation and gets out. Well, you've got all kinds of things. You've got discrimination, you've got prejudice, you've got all kinds of treatments that are going to be, detrimental based on racial association. That's kind of what's happening there. But then, of course, you've got the southern slave. And the southern slave is entering the dark ages now, because the southern slave, here's the problem. In 1808, they cut off the slave trade. Now, when you ban slavery, here's the problem. You have no new inputs except for those that you can manipulate from the inside out. I think this changes us a bit. I think this makes us more, I don't know how to put it, more racially biased and more racially negative towards each other, because here's the situation. If I lose a slave, if a slave escapes, well, the simple solution is to import them. Import a new slave. Okay, fine, I got a new slave. The problem is now, with no new imports, is you have to really manipulate your slave population. You have to really get aggressive in terms of how you manage who they are, but also how they work, how they survive, and also you're starting to go deep into the family structure now, which is just dark and twisted. So now you start looking at this and you start seeing things happening, and that's, of course, a big change in what's going on. In the cities now, you're starting to see a burgeoning middle class. I describe the middle class perhaps as the people who get into what you call management positions. They're not the owners, but they're the ones that run the show for the owners in many different positions in societies. And with education increasing the ranks of the educated elite, education is now pushing people into different ideas. So one of the key things that this starts happening is that people start to leave the farm. And I know this is sounding sad, but farm life is hard. And you've seen this trend happening all the way back to the 1820s, where people start saying, I'm going to get out of here. I'm going to get myself a job. I'm going to go to school. I'm going to make my life better. Hang on one second. I got to check something. I just realized I have a little delay. All right, last but not least, we've got a couple of statements here that need to be added in. Hang on one second. Let me make sure it's turned on. My bad. Sorry, I had to step away for a little bit. But in terms of the effect of this middle class management education, pushing people off the farms, moving people around, one of the things it's creating it's creating a change in the attitudes of family. Separate spheres concept. Spheres. Basically states men are superior outside the home, women are superior inside the home. These concepts are best kind of understood as we start to see this middle class emerging at the time period. What's going to happen is your birth rate's going to go down. Birth rate goes down. You're also going to see a change in the age of marriage. Marriage is going to go up. And that's a consequence that's going to have an effect on a lot of people. Outside the home, a lot of people are joining up voluntary associations. A vertical allegiance, just think of it like this. Allegiance. Oh, that's terrible. Gotta learn how to write. A vertical allegiance, look at it like this on a line where you start off at the bottom as the worker, and then you might become an apprentice, and then eventually, if you're good enough over time, you might become the owner of the business or the property. That's kind of like the way a family works. Parents in charge, kids are going to follow the rules of the father and the mother, and that's kind of the idea behind that. What's changing now is that you're starting to see a idea about something on this line, the horizontal, of course. And the horizontal allegiance is changing the way we think about each other. So on this, now we've got this nice, straight, horizontal line like this. And what you start seeing happening here are people from, let's say we have a association, like for instance, a religion, or let's say it's a job, or let's say it's a society of some sort, like the Rotary Club. What you have is people along the line from all different walks of life. And what starts happening, of course, is that this guy might be rich, this guy might be middle, and this gal over here might be poor. But what's unique is they all relate to each other because they're all relating in a different way. Now this is interesting because what de Tocqueville kind of mentioned and saw is that no matter what, we tend to blend really nicely with each other as a culture. And the other thing about it is that you start to see organizations form regarding that blending. Organizations, and these organizations are going to take on issues, and the issues later on, they're going to be significant, of course, are the ones that really are controversial. So this is a pretty interesting chapter. Hope you enjoyed it, and hope that it helps you understand a little bit better. Okay, friends, we're back again. We have a new chapter, chapter 10, which is a big one. It seems like a lot. Let's talk about a few things that we see happening here right off the bat. First of all, the election of 1824 is the corrupt bargain election. And the reason it's called the corrupt bargain election is because you have another problem with the Electoral College. What you had was you had John Quincy Adams, the son of John Adams, who was running what you would call a Whig or a Federalist, his father's old party. And then from out of the West, you had Andy Jackson, and you had also Henry Clay. Now, these two guys together, this is the reason why third-party politics doesn't really help the two-party system, is that if one of them ran and not the other, they would have won easily. But the problem is that if you add a fourth candidate in there, whose name is Crawford, he's kind of a throwaway. But if you add in a fourth candidate, you split the vote, so there's no majority. So if there's no majority, it has to go into the House. And in the House, the deal was made to advance one person's career, Henry Clay, as Secretary of State. That was the way he got appeased and, bought out of the system. But in response to that, they picked John Quincy Adams, and Jackson never forgot the snub. So that was a big deal. That was a big process. Over the 4 years between 1824 and 1828, you saw a change in that all of a sudden now you have white males who don't own property who can vote. And that's known as universal manhood suffrage. The concept, of course, is that you have people who can now vote who are not part of the elite. and that is going to change the whole aspect of not only the White House but also politics in general. As I mentioned today, with the vaulting of Jackson into office, Jackson truly is your first modern president. Wouldn't say he's modern, but he's your first true active president. Although he would probably be more aligned with Thomas Jefferson's philosophies, the Republican philosophies, he doesn't care as long as it's about his position. And what he's going to do is that he's going to bring the executive branch into modern political politics. And he's going to be a force with a couple of things. His veto and his, I don't know what the word is. It's, I know there's a word in government for it, but his, his belief in the separation of powers, that he does not believe that he has to do what the other branches tell him to do. And that is best, of course, seen when he creates the Trail of Tears, because he ignores the orders of Chisholm versus Georgia and Cherokee Nation versus Georgia. Two court cases that were martial court cases, and martial court cases were, of course, federal in nature. And Jackson, of course, is against that. But on the other hand, if you cross him, he'll definitely use his power to block you and to strengthen his own position. Oh, that was way too loud. You start to see this word show up here. It is a belief that goes back to the Articles of Confederation that a state has the power under the 10th Amendment to ignore a federal command or a federal law. And it goes back to the belief structure that, states are the fundamental basis for our union, and states should have, the central power. But the question, of course, is how far can they go? What we start seeing happening in this chapter is a question over economics that is going to start to divide the North from the South. And the key question is, the North is all about factories, and the South is all about the propagation of cotton, because slave cotton is going to be the cheapest cotton in the world at this time in history, and that's going to make them, quite profitable. In this case, you've got an individual who's going to play a huge role in that nullification concept. His name is John C. Calhoun, and John Calhoun wants to be president of the United States. The problem is that he's from the South, and his main issue, of course, is the slave economy, because that's all he's got going for him in terms of his politics. The downside for him is that he can't get power from the North to kind of vault himself into power in the White House. So he is faced with an adversary in Daniel Webster. And Daniel Webster and John C. Calhoun are famous as senators who create probably the most prolific debates in American government history. They often spoke for 3 hours at a time. And remember, in the Senate, there's no rule about time, so they could speak for a long, long time. And they used all kinds of great devices and arguments to kind of push their position. But together, for about 20 years, they're going to be the centerpieces for the free labor concept of the North versus the unfree labor concept of the South, which is, of course, held in bondage via slavery. Congress is, although you still have the 3/5 balance, which, of course, the deal was the South gets to count slaves towards its representation. The North, what they get out of the deal is they get the slave ban of 1808, which is going to give them at least the concept that the South won't keep increasing its numbers just by importation of slaves via the nasty triangle trade route, which is, of course, historically bad in terms of lots of things. But the main thing is that it was the cheapest way to import that labor into the South. So one of the things that's starting to happen is, with immigration taking place, and immigration being mostly out of the poorer sections of Europe. Most of them are moving into the north. Most of them are moving into factories. And because that, they're bolstering their numbers. Their numbers are starting to make a big difference in terms of like their representation. So what's starting to happen is Congress is starting to lean towards the north, and the south is starting to panic. One of the signs of that panic is in the Tariff of 1828. And in the Tariff of 1828, also known as the Tariff of Abomination, that was a tax on cotton. And the tariff, of course, was designed to be protective of northern industry, but the cotton was the key issue of that. Calhoun and others are going to rally against that, and they're going to push nullification into the concept and the argument. And they're going to argue that a state doesn't have to follow the rules, knock it off, of the federal government in terms of what it does. The famous statement that kind of gets pushed out there is the South Carolina Exposition and Protest. So the South Carolina Exposition and Protest. And that was the kind of like the thesis about like why the South shouldn't have to follow the rules and why it shouldn't have to come up with that. If you combine that with a slave revolt in 1831, the most violent of them all, the Nat Turner slave revolt, that one resulted in the deaths of dozens of escaped slaves, and it also resulted in the deaths of many slave owners. Of course, this is going to create more harsh conditions for not only slaves, but freed blacks in the North, which I think is a huge problem. And you're going to see a push to get a stronger Fugitive Slave Act later, which is going to make life miserable for people who are trying to eke out a living without having DNA to kind of, prove that they're not a slave and they're not going to be able to be captured and taken back to the North. So, here's the key thing. The idea about this tariff of abominations was that Calhoun is so upset about it that he is pushing the South into this corner where they're starting to say, hey, we're starting to move, we're starting to get ourselves away from this concept. We should have the freedom to do whatever we want to do. And we're starting to see a push on the other side, which is, well, how far do you let this go? How far do you make this go? So the tariff of 1833 was called the Compromise Tariff. And the tariff of 1833 was designed to take off a lot of the punitive damages of the tariff of 1828. It was the Compromise Tariff. So it was trying to give the South a break. Of course we hear your problems, we hear you're angry about this, but let's just give you this idea that we'll deal with you. So one of the things that happens is that if you give in to a demand, it often gives the opposition the thought that, hey, we have the ability to keep pushing for this demand, which could be logical. It happened in the American Revolution. Every time the British took away one of our tariffs, we thought, hey, we got the upper hand. We have this idea. And Andrew Jackson is going to shut that down by pushing the force bill on the South, which is a threat. It's a threat that we will use military force. And the military force is, of course, under the wing of the federal government's executive branch. And Jackson, being an old war hero, he's, fully capable and happy to throw that threat down to scare the South into, caving into the demands of the people who are saying nullification is the way to go. That is the beginning of the Andrew Jackson that we start to see becoming more powerful and more effective. And where you start to see a really interesting development is, of course, in simple stuff like the bank policies or the bank veto, and the way it played a role in the election of 1832. It divided the country into what used to be Federalist and Republican zones. But Jackson's going to use it, as a political whipping boy to get the West and the South to fall into line under his policies. And fortunately or unfortunately, his actual whipping boy was Nicholas Biddle. And remember, the way you remember Biddle, of course, is Biddle's Bank. Biddle's Bank. Who is the president of the National Bank. And what is going to happen is that most things in government are not permanent. They often are temporary. And what happens in a lot of cases is that they create deals which say that for a term we'll have this in place. And the bank charter was up for renewal, and Congress re-upped it. Congress is going to pass the bank charter, and what of course Jackson does is that he vetoes it, and the veto is a tremendous amount of power that the executive has, because what it can do is it can block something that is created by the people directly, which is the branch of government which is most responsive to the people, which is the Congress itself. So, as a result of that, you start to see him becoming more states' rights in terms of its concept, even though he's not states' rights when it comes down to the South saying it can do whatever it wants. And that was pretty much the way he's going to take this election, even though he had some competition from the likes of other individuals who are kind of like trying to chip away at his you know his power structure. His vice president in 1832 is going to be Martin Van Buren. They called him Old Kinderhook, which is where he was from in New York. And this is where we get the term OK, because his slogan was OK, as in Old Kinderhook. And if you're from OK, then you're OK. He's also the 7th president of the United States, and the reason we know this is because there's a great Seinfeld episode where George holds up 7 fingers while he holds a salt shaker, and he scares the Van Buren boys, who's a gang from New York City, into beating him up. So I know that because of Seinfeld, which is very handy if you're trying to remember the presidents in order. Just a little tip for you to take in case you ever wanted to watch Seinfeld. So the bank veto actually is going to start to divide our country into two-party systems. And the two parties at this time in history are the Democrats, and the Democrats are mostly what we would call Republicans today, and the Whigs. And the Whigs are what you would call Federalists or Democrats. And the war on the bank is just going to exemplify this, because Jackson cannot let it go. He cannot allow the bank to have the power to dictate terms. But what he does with the bank, ironically, is he's gonna create a panic. He's going to create a run on the stock market when he leaves office, and it's really created by the instability of having no bank to hold the money and to back it up. So the guy who gets the blame for this is Van Buren. Van Buren is going to be a one-term president because he has to handle one of the first, or actually the second, major depression in American history. And it wasn't even his fault in the first place. It was good old Andrew Jackson who just set it up and let it go. But even within the Democratic Party, you started to see divisions. You know, the Loco Focos, what a great name for a political party. You started to see a divide in the Democratic Party, and it was mostly between East and West. And what this is the North Working Man's Party. So the North Working Man's Party is going to differ from Jackson's Southwest Party, and the Locofocos are going to start to kind of like, draw support away from the Democratic Party, which, interestingly enough, is going to lead to a group of individuals to challenge the Jackson presidency and knock him out of office in the next term. And for the next few election cycles, you start to see a flip-flop of one-term presidents. You see a lot of one-term presidents now. Let me erase that. You see a lot of one-termers, and I think the main reason is because of this divide. And one term plus out is kind of the theme you're going to start to notice. And the other thing about it is you have some of the first deaths of presidents, which is not uncommon. But then again, so they are of natural causes early on, but later we'll have assassinations playing a role with that. So this is the significance of the elections and the effects on Jackson's presidency and what that is. For instance, one of the things that comes out of this is the idea of the specie circular, which is it's kind of like a concept where you try to keep the banks backing their paper. You try to get the banks to back their paper with coin, which is the simple way of putting with precious metals, because we have a limited amount of that, and the value, of course, goes up when you have a limited amount of something like that. So Van Buren can't survive himself. They call himself the Little Magician. He is kind of short, actually. But as a result of that, his attempts to manipulate it with the Treasury bill and other effects just don't seem to work out. And now, in 1840, by the time his first term has wound out, the election of 1840 was really one of the first interesting political elections where you had the first war hero. Well, I take that back. Andrew Jackson ran on a war hero platform, War of 1812. So war heroes are kind of influential in politics because they harken back to positive times, I suppose. But what you had William Henry Harrison, who was the hero of defeating the tribe. I can't remember the name of the tribe, but he defeated Tecumseh and his brother, the Prophet. And William Henry Harrison was the hero of the Battle of Tippecanoe. And we have the first true, interesting, active campaign. We have had campaigns before, but campaigns now, they take on this really interesting flavor. This is known as the Log Cabin and Hard Cider Campaign. Log Cabin in that Harrison is from the West, so his symbol was, of course, I'm from the West, I know who you are, I'm also a war hero from the Battle of Tippecanoe. That's a terrible way of spelling that over there. Sorry about that. Let me fix it. Yes, that totally made a huge difference, didn't it? But being that he's from the West, there was also this really weird use of alcohol. And what they did was they would stop at a site, a city, and they would give speeches. So they would give their speeches, and these are called stump speeches for a reason, because they would stand on a cut tree stump or some platform, no microphones. They'd have to shout, and sometimes the speeches lasted for hours, which of course would kill the speaker. Imagining speaking in front of 1,000 people who were just standing around for 2 hours in the hot sun, that would be kind of a problem. So to compensate them after the speeches, they literally, and this is where it gets interesting, they would literally roll out the barrel, which is where the where the song comes from. Let me fix that. Rolling out the barrel was a way of compensating the voter with alcohol. And what was really interesting was that you started to see a trend where the more alcohol, the more likely that candidate or that party would be electable by the public. So remember, the common man is still the common man, and alcohol still plays a huge role in our culture. And is there any wonder why people in temperance movements are saying, well, alcohol is the curse of death, because all of a sudden now all these people are just being, drunkards to vote for a candidate who wants to become president of the United States. So the really powerful concept about this was the the idea about the hard cider campaign was that they began to actively pursue votes. And I don't know where this crosses the line from what you call it lobbying or influence, but notice that even today we still see a powerful impact of money. I mean, people are paying for the alcohol for somebody. They're not just giving it away for free. So that was the idea of the concept behind that. So Harrison wins. And Harrison, oh, by the way, the slogan is Tippecanoe and Tyler too. And an easy way to remember these presidents, Tippecanoe and Tyler too. And sadly, but surely, this is the instance of the first movement of a vice president into the presidency. Because when Van Buren loses and William Henry Harrison wins the election, you see this terrible thing happen. And I think I'm going to double check my fact real quick. I think it's correct. But I think William Henry Harrison is going to eat a bowl of rancid cherries and cream, because during the um, during the inauguration, of course, there's big parties. One of his favorite thing, of course, was be to eat fruit, and a lot of the fruit was canned. Oh, that's awful. God, I wish my handwriting was better for you in terms of like what you could see with this. In cream. Um, there's no pasteurization. There's no refrigeration. Things are going to go bad. There's no germ theory. Nobody knows what the hell's going on. And what he's going to get is gastroenteritis, which is treatable today. You know, you could treat this stuff, but it's going to kill him. And he dies within days of his inauguration, which, of course, is quite traumatic. So Tyler becomes known as the first accidental president, and he totally resents the term because, of course, it doesn't, bode well for his ego and for his political career to be known as the guy who, you know, accidentally stepped into the presidency because the other guy ate a bad bowl of cherries. But being that he's the first accidental president, you actually get to see the Constitution at work, where the succession of vice president to president happens peacefully and without turmoil. And of course, Tyler becomes a one-term president that we forget and we don't know much about because, let's face it, he doesn't do much in terms of what goes on in that time period and what happens. So this is pretty much the end of the politics end of things here. But here's where I think the second part of the chapter really kind of takes off. It's really about the Second Great Awakening. This is huge in terms of its impact. Of course, it's about a religion, a religious movement. But what you're seeing is, once again, personal, individual, relationship. That is the best way to put it. That is impacted by human choices in relation to a higher power. That is crucial. People think and believe they have an impact that they can evoke on their lives and on the lives of others, and it's tremendous in terms of its social, political, and economic impact in the way we think about each other. But one of the most famous parts of the Great Awakening, of course, was the process of tapping emotions, and also tapping the concept of guilt and sin. Those are powerful motivators. So one of the things that you started to see, they called them the burned out regions, was people would show up and they would have huge tent revivals where they would try to get as many people to show up as possible and to try to experience this transformation. And what they're really committing to, of course, is a religious idea, but more importantly, they're committing to to a personal change in their lives. And you're starting to see a split in religious concepts. You start to see, of course, Methodists. You're starting to see Congregationalists. You're starting to see the splinter groups from that showing up. But the Eastern revivals, and the most famous of all of them, was led by Charles Finney. Charles Finney. Oops, let me fix that one right there. Get that rid of that. Looks like a T. Charles Finney was probably the most popular of them all in terms of what he was able to accomplish. And his revivals were well known for affecting thousands, if not millions of people. I think one of the concepts is that by the end, millions of people will be affected by how this goes by. And they called them harvests, in that they're going through a concept of transformation. They're trying to transformation and revive people and their commitment to not only religion, but also to how they look at their behavior. Which, here's the thing, I think this is crucial. One of the things that you're going to start happening is, politics is dramatically impacted by people believing they can actually do something in the world. And the second thing are all of the reforms of society that are just being pushed so hard by different individuals and groups of people in terms of how that worked. you had you had a change in a lot of things, and one of the key developmental things is that you're starting to see education being linked to this. You're starting to see a concept of like people who are who are going into a mental process of understanding nature as humans, and also in terms of nature in natural rights, and in terms of a religious belief. And it's all happening pretty much very quickly at the same time. And then you start to see some developments, or developments that are kind of like American experiences. You start to see Mormonism, you start to see the Shakers, you start to see the Unitarians, and you start to see other groups develop because of that. Um, one of the one of the extreme developments of this, of course, I'll stop that. One of the extreme developments of this group, of course, are the utopian communities. Uh, Utopian communities are trying to come up with a new way of living, and where is it linked to? It's relating to what the goal is of the higher power, and also for the religious concept of like how that works, and how that could develop itself in terms of what it does. Um, from the reform element, I think the reform is in three. I don't know how you would describe it, but you're trying to take a society, of course, that has flaws, and you're trying to come up with solutions. And the solutions are sometimes simple, but sometimes they're not, in terms of what they are. So let's just talk about, a couple of things. Let's talk about behavior. One of the key behavioral issues in American history, of course, is crime usually is related to intoxicating substances. If you look at most crimes that occur today, they're occurred under the influence. I think more than half of all violent crimes, the suspect is under the influence. So a person who's wise would say, if you eliminate the substance, maybe the crimes go down. And I don't know if it's chicken before the egg type of thinking, but one of the key behaviors that we start seeing is, we have a serious problem with alcohol. We always have. And the idea behind alcohol is that it's part of culture, but it's also an addictive substance that sometimes is hard to understand. How does it do that to a person who starts off in control of their numbers of consumptive items, and then all of a sudden loses control because of a biological, psychological response? And it is biological and psychological in terms of its nature. So temperance societies were formed to talk about, getting people to lessen or eliminate it. And one of the famous, leaders of that was Carrie Nation. I think her actual name was Carrie A. Nation, which I think is a made-up name. But uh, Carrie Nation was one of those radicals who went into saloons and tried to smash the saloons up with axes and with bats and such. And she was really a militant about this. Others, such as the Beechers, Beecher Stowe, and also Miss Beecher, who wrote about separate spheres. Make sure I have that right. Fix this one. Alcohol. Beecher also wrote articles about how it's hurting families, and it's hurting the idea behind how society should run. So that was one. Another one that you started to see is the idea of public school. And this goes back to Jefferson talking about an educated farmer. Education wasn't really needed for most of American history because our jobs didn't really require it. Of course, the elites would educate themselves and read and write and read poetry and Latin and such, but not everybody would. But the public school is a really interesting concept because it harkens to this self-improvement concept. Unfortunately, they didn't have a good model for it, so they used a lot of corporal punishment and tried to beat improvement into kids. But the public school is one of those ideas that if we can move society in a way, we can improve who we are and also what we come up with in terms of solutions to some of our problems. That led us down the road to thinking about how we treat other people, and that, of course, would be the development of abolition. And William Lloyd Garrison was of course, the the publisher of The Liberator, which was based in Boston, Massachusetts, and Frederick Douglass, who we'll hear about later, who was a freed slave, who educates himself and starts writing about the power of slavery and its destructive set, is going to also play a big role in that. But you're starting to see the abolition movement line up with religious reform, and religion is going to play a role both in justifying slavery and also in terms of taking it away. But one of the areas that I mentioned the most in terms of its impact, of course, is the way it impacts people in terms of the power to vote, and we describe that as suffrage rights. And the one group, going way back to Abigail Adams, who told her husband, remember the ladies, when we talk about revolution, ladies are left out of the voting process. So at Seneca Falls, we had the first meeting of suffragettes to talk about the concept of women's suffrage. And we have Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, the original women who are going to begin the concept discussion of when can you allow us to have the right to vote, are going to begin a long process that takes us all the way until 1920 to allow women into the voting areas. And then you have individuals who are talking about crime and punishment. Go away. Why is it doing this? I must be hitting something with my hand on this damn piece of tablet here. Sorry. Go away. Where's my pen? There it is. Where is it? There it is. Crime plus penitentiaries. How do you reform a criminal? What does it take? Does it take punishment? Does it take education? What is the concept behind it? And those ideas, of course, are leading us into a way of thinking about how do you fix things that are broken? How do you fix things that don't really work? And this is going to lead us to talk about insane asylums and other areas of life, which of course are hard to fix and hard to deal with. Workhouses and others that are mostly not really dealt with in people's ways of thinking. All right. For the most part, this chapter is big, and it's big for a reason. It's got these three big themes. It's got, of course, the rise of the presidency under Andrew Jackson presidency. It's got the role of religion under the Pete's sake. Let me fix that. Under the Second Great Awakening. Which triggers off this concept of reform, both on a personal and societal level. Big chapter, but then again, it's one that I think is useful for you to kind of pay attention to. And also, if you have questions, be sure to ask them, because it can be confusing. This concludes chapter 10. Hope you enjoyed it. I'll talk to you soon.